All right, so today we are going deep, really deep, into the work of, kind of a giant in 20th century moral philosophy, R.M. Hare. So what was it, do you think, that made this guy tick? What was the driving force behind his work?
Oh, it was ambition, pure and simple, intellectual ambition. Hare, he actually had this striking image. He described it once like he'd finally climbed to the top of this philosophical mountain, thinking he'd finally cracked the code, like he'd figured out the rational answer to moral questions.
Oh, wow.
And here's the kicker. When he got to the top, he found himself surrounded by, get this, by the graves of all the other philosophers who had tried and failed to do the same thing.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a powerful image, isn't it? It really kind of captures the sheer scale of what he was trying to achieve. And I mean, his project was huge. He basically wanted to take all these different strands of thought, Aristotle, Kant, Mill, and weave them all together into this single coherent ethical system. And the key to all this, the thing that really tied it all together, was his development of prescriptivism.
Yeah, and for a philosopher listening to this, I think they'd immediately get how ambitious and just logically demanding that project was. It was a huge undertaking.
Absolutely. And I mean, while he didn't necessarily create a whole school of Harean philosophers, his influence, especially in British ethics, was massive. And a lot of his students, they talk about how his teaching, it wasn't just about learning a set of doctrines. It was about a training, a discipline in philosophical thinking itself. That's what really stuck with them.
Absolutely. And, that's something we want to capture in this deep dive. We're not just going to lay out a bunch of dry facts. We want to, really get into the nuts and bolts of Hare's system, make it clear, and, hopefully kind of spark something, get people thinking.
Exactly. So for all you philosophy buffs out there, buckle up. All right. So let's start, I guess, at the beginning. Richard Mervyn Hare, born in 1919, gets this really classical education at Rugby and then Balliol College, Oxford. I mean, it's kind of interesting, isn't it? You think about the kind of rigorous logic that his work is known for, and it doesn't seem like the most obvious starting point, does it? This very traditional classical education.
It's true. And, it makes you wonder about how those early experiences, how they shaped him. And, he had some pretty formative ones. I mean, think about it. He had to grapple with the decision to fight in World War II. Then he ends up a prisoner of war on the River Kwai. He went through what he called violent, untiring labors.
Cool.
And, he didn't really dwell on the suffering, not publicly anyway, but it's clear that it had a profound impact on him. It gave him, I think, a real sense of the weight of human experience, something that he felt was sometimes missing, in the abstract debates of academic philosophy, especially from those who, maybe hadn't experienced that kind of hardship.
Yeah, that's a really important point. It gives us context, So after the war, he goes back to Oxford, becomes a tutor at Balliol. Can you imagine being in one of his tutorials? I mean, you've got these future philosophical heavyweights, right? Bernard Williams, David Pears, Richard Wollheim, John Lucas, all these guys, all in the same room, just hammering away at his ideas, testing them, challenging them.
That's a lot of brain power in one room.
Yeah, and Lucas, he actually tells this story about how they'd spend the whole day, systematically trying to tear apart Hare's arguments, with Williams, always ready with what he thought was the knockout blow. And apparently Williams never quite managed to land it.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that really speaks to, I think, the strength and, the rigor of Hare's thought, doesn't it?
Totally. It also suggests a certain, a certain intellectual humility, when you say this, willingness to really engage with opposing viewpoints, to take them seriously.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think he really believed that a lot of philosophical disagreements, they stemmed from, just a lack of clarity, a failure to really understand each other.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of telling, isn't it, that his last book, he called it Sorting Out Ethics. He really thought that philosophy could help us get our heads straight. Make sense of things. And speaking of making sense of things, later in his career, he moves to Corpus Christi and then eventually ends up at the University of Florida. And I think this move, it kind of signaled a shift in his focus, a move towards more applied philosophy, where he was trying to, bring his theoretical ideas to bear on actual real-world ethical issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting, isn't it, how his personal life, it kind of intertwines with his philosophical work. I mean, his marriage to Catherine Verney, it was, by all accounts, a really happy and fulfilling partnership. They shared a deep commitment to their faith, Anglicanism, although they approached it in slightly different ways. They both loved music, especially choral music. And then there was his role as a father, which was really important to him. He actually said once that, for him, Aristotle's question, what sort of person should I be? It kind of transformed into this more immediate question, what sort of person should I bring up my children to be?
Yeah, I love that quote. It's so human, isn't it? And, for a philosopher, someone who's thinking about these big abstract questions, it's really grounding to see that personal lived experience informing his work. It's not just some detached intellectual exercise. It's connected to the stuff that really matters, to how we live our lives.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, so let's dive into the heart of his theory, shall we? Now, Hare, like the emotivists, he recognized the challenge that empiricism posed to the idea of objective moral facts. But unlike the emotivists, he wasn't content to reduce moral language to just, expressions of emotion or attempt to manipulate people. He thought that emotivism, it missed something really crucial about the way moral language actually works, about its function.
Right, right. And what's really fascinating, especially for a philosopher, is how he brought this together with his engagement with Kant. He saw this this deep rationality in the very idea of an imperative, something that, wasn't really being talked about much in British philosophy at the time.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and this recognition of the rational force of commands, it became a cornerstone of his whole system.
Okay, so this leads us straight to one of the most important ideas in the language of morals, right? The distinction between prescriptive and descriptive meaning. So for Hare, a statement has prescriptive meaning if it logically entails at least one imperative. And of course, this imperative, it can be combined with, factual statements, descriptive statements. But the point is, to really agree with an imperative, it means you're prescribing that action. You're saying it should be done. And then you've got descriptive meaning, which is all about the factual conditions that make a statement true or false.
Exactly. And the really clever thing is how Hare applies this distinction to moral statements. So take a classic example, A ought to. Now for Hare, this contains a hidden prescription, right? It's saying, let A. If you genuinely believe that A ought to do Faye, then you're also implicitly saying let it do Faye. And this implies, some kind of motivation, some kind of desire to see A actually doing. And then on top of that, you've got the descriptive element, right? So there might be shared factual reasons within a community for why thieving is a good thing. Maybe it promotes well-being or something like that. So it's this combination of the prescriptive and the descriptive that makes moral language so powerful and so tricky to analyze.
And this is where, a philosopher would really sit up and take notice, because this framework, it provides a really elegant way to address Hume's is-ought problem, because moral statements, they've got this prescriptive element that's just not there in purely factual statements. You can't just jump from an is to an ought. And it connects really nicely with Kant's emphasis on the role of imperatives in practical reason.
Yeah, absolutely. But, there's a kind of an obvious objection here that a lot of, especially logicians, but a lot of ethicists too, they jumped on this right away. So if saying I ought to logically implies, let me then why doesn't it always follow that I will? I mean, we all know that people don't always live up to their moral beliefs. So what was Hare's response to that? How did he deal with this disconnect between, what we say we ought to do and what we actually do?
Yeah, that's a great question. So initially, Hare, he kind of pointed to cases where there might be psychological incapacity, or where the ought is being used in a kind of a weakened sense, like an off-color use, where it doesn't have that full force of prescription. He even drew parallels to, Socrates and Aristotle and their struggles to figure out how moral knowledge translates into moral action. But later on, especially in Freedom and Reason and in some of his papers on weakness of will, he started to offer more nuanced explanations. He even entertained the idea of something like Plato's divided soul, to explain how people can consciously contradict themselves in their actions.
Interesting. So for a philosopher listening to this, they'd see these shifting responses as Hare really grappling with this core problem in ethics, right? This problem of how we can know what's right and still fail to do it.
Exactly. And then there's this whole other layer of complexity, right?
Yeah.
Hare wanted to develop a formal logic of imperatives, which was a pretty radical idea at the time.
That was a huge undertaking.
Totally. So he started with this broad category of tellings to, which included not just commands, but also advice, even self-addressed imperatives like intentions. And what they all have in common is this direction of fit, right? They're all aimed at changing the world to match the imperative. And he contrasted this with tellings that, which are basically informative statements that try to represent the world as it is.
So the basic idea, and this is where it gets a bit tricky, but stick with me. The basic idea is that if telling you that P implicitly tells you that Q, because, P logically entails Q, then telling you to do X should also implicitly tell you to do Y if there's some kind of logical connection between them. But the problem, of course, is figuring out what that logical connection is, what it means for one imperative to implicitly prescribe another. That's where things get really thorny.
Yeah, exactly. And this is where, if you're a logician, you start to see all these really interesting problem cases popping up. So for example, you've got these seemingly straightforward imperative-only inferences like do X and Y, therefore do X. This seems pretty solid, right? It's based on what Hare called the logic of satisfaction. If the state of affairs that satisfies the premise, doing X and Y, well, then it must also satisfy the conclusion, which is just doing X. But then you get cases like do X, therefore do X or Y. Now, this doesn't seem quite as solid, does it?
No, not really. And Bernard Williams, he actually argued that this kind of inference, it carries its hidden permissive presupposition. Like it's suggesting that doing Y is also okay, even though the premise only tells you to do X.
Right. And Hare's counter-argument, it appealed to the whole idea of conversational implicature. He's saying that, yeah, maybe there's this hint of permission in do X or Y, but it's just a conversational suggestion. And it gets canceled out by the more specific premise, do X. And even really simple examples like light the fuse and step back 3 paces, therefore light the fuse. Even this gets complicated.
Yeah, I mean, you might hesitate to just say light the fuse on its own, right? Because you're worried the person might not remember to step back.
Exactly. And Hare would probably say that, look, any suggestion that light the fuse is all you need to do, that gets overridden by the initial instruction, which included stepping back. He was really big on this idea of contextual correction, like the context of the utterance can change the meaning of the imperative.
Right. And then you get into even trickier territory with like mixed inferences. That's where you've got premises that are a mix of indicative statements, factual statements and imperative statements. And the simple logic of satisfaction, it doesn't really cut it here. Take Aristotle's example, right? He says that intending to make a cloak logically implies intending to perform all the actions necessary to make a cloak. That seems to fit with the logic of satisfaction, but then
you get cases like intending to get drunk, implying intending to have a hangover. I mean, nobody actually intends to have a hangover, do they?
Well, someone might jokingly say, hey, if you're telling me to get drunk, are you also telling me to have a hangover? But of course, the inference doesn't hold logically because we don't usually intend the negative side effects of our actions, even if they're foreseeable.
Right. And this highlights, this need for some kind of constraints within a logic of imperatives. Like you need to be able to distinguish between the intended goal and the necessary means to achieve that goal, and the unintended but foreseeable consequences.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, of course, there are conditional imperatives. I mean, these things are just a minefield. Take these 2 statements. If you want to get drunk every evening, you should work in a bar. And if you want to get drunk every evening, you shouldn't work in a bar. I mean, these seem contradictory, right?
Totally.
But we can all imagine situations where both of them could be true. So how do you make sense of that?
Well, Hare's solution, it was pretty clever, but also kind of controversial. He said that the embedded clause, the you want to get drunk every evening part, it actually functions differently in the 2 statements. In this second one, it's like an embedded indicative clause. It's just describing a desire. So you can detach the conclusion you shouldn't work in a bar based on other implicit premises, like maybe the negative consequences of working in a bar if you're trying to avoid hangovers. But in the first statement, he says it's like an embedded imperative. It's like saying get drunk every evening. So you can detach the conclusion, work in a bar, because it's seen as a means to achieve that embedded imperative.
Wow, okay. That's pretty subtle. So for a philosopher who's really into the logic of moral arguments, this distinction is, well, it's really important, isn't it?
Absolutely. And this brings us to one of the most famous objections to Hare's whole system, the Frege-Geach problem. The basic idea is that if moral judgments are really just imperatives at heart, then they shouldn't be able to appear embedded within conditional clauses or in indirect speech. Because, in those contexts, imperatives kind of lose their force. They're not directly telling you to do anything.
Right, and Peter Geach, he was one of the main proponents of this objection. He argued really forcefully against any philosophical view that denied that moral judgments could be true or false,
Yeah, and Hare's response, initially it drew on Gilbert Ryle's idea of inference tickets. He's saying that these conditional moral statements, they're like rules or licenses for making inferences from one prescription to another, even if they're not being directly asserted. But later on, he kind of refined this response with his concepts of tropic and nougistic.
Yes, the tropic and the nougistic. Okay, remind me, what are those again?
So the tropic, that's basically the mood of the speech act, like the imperative form. And the nougistic, That's like a sign of endorsement or subscription, kind of like Frege's assertion sign. So Hare's saying that when an imperative gets embedded in a larger statement, the tropic might stay the same, but the nusanstic, the explicit endorsement, that disappears. That's why the embedded moral term, it can still have this logical influence on the overall statement.
Okay, I'm starting to see how that works. So for a philosopher who's analyzing how moral language functions, this is pretty crucial stuff, isn't it?
Totally. And just to be clear, the Frege-Geach problem, it's still being debated today. It's not like Hare's response completely settled the issue. John Erickson, he's done some really interesting work building on Hare's ideas about descriptive meaning and universalizability, trying to come up with a more comprehensive solution.
Yeah.
The basic idea is that when we say something is morally bad, we're doing it based on some underlying bad-making characteristic. And so the validity of inferences involving moral judgments, it depends on whether those bad-making characteristics are being applied consistently.
But even this approach, it has its problems, right? I mean,
Yeah.
the speaker might only have a vague idea of what those bad-making characteristics are, and the listener might have a completely different interpretation. So it seems like Hare's system could benefit from a more robust account of how speakers and listeners actually understand each other when they're talking about morality.
Yeah, definitely. And then there's the issue of moral predicates in indirect speech, like S believes that lying is wrong. Hare, he didn't really offer a fully developed solution to this, but our analysis suggests that he could have used his concept of descriptive meaning to address it. Like, if you want to understand what S believes, you need to figure out, what factual grounds S would use to universally forbid lying.
Right. Okay. So let's move on to, I guess, what you could call the twin pillars of Hare's theory, prescriptivity and universalizability. I mean, these are the concepts that really made him famous, right? He even wrote a whole paper just to clarify the difference between universal and general as they apply to moral maxims. And this distinction, it actually cleared up a lot of confusion, even in the work of Aristotle and Kant. I mean, that's a pretty big contribution in itself.
Absolutely. And in his early work, especially in the language of morals, Hare makes this kind of a surprising claim. He says that a lot of our moral decisions, they actually establish moral principles rather than just following from them. Like when you decide not to tell a lie in a particular situation, that might be a more immediate judgment than, adopting this big general principle, never tell lies.
Interesting. So it's like our moral reasoning, it's not always top-down, right? Sometimes it's more bottom-up. We start with specific cases and then work our way up to more general principles.
Exactly. And then in Freedom and Reason, he develops this really famous argument, the Golden Rule argument. And he uses this great example of a debtor, a creditor, and the possibility of imprisonment. So imagine you've got a creditor, B, and he decides that he ought to imprison his debtor, A. Now, what Hare is saying is that by doing this, B is committing himself to a general principle, a principle that would apply universally to all similar situations. So if B himself ever ended up in debt, his own creditor, C, would be justified in imprisoning him.
Oh, I see. So it's like when you universalize your moral judgment, you have to be willing to accept the consequences if you were in the other person's shoes.
Exactly. And Hare argues that this process of universalization, it can make it really hard to hold on to your initial judgment. Like, if B really thinks about what it would mean for him to be imprisoned if he were the debtor, he might start to have second thoughts about imprisoning A.
Right. But what about fanatics? The people who are willing to accept terrible consequences for themselves in the name of some abstract ideal. How does Hare deal with that?
Yeah, that's a good question. In his later work, he tries to address this by connecting moral ideals to underlying universal preferences. Like, he's saying that it's highly unlikely that someone would genuinely prioritize some abstract ideal over all of their own personal interests. And this move, it kind of signals a shift in his thinking towards a kind of preference satisfaction utilitarianism. And then in moral thinking, he takes this argument even further. He argues that when we sincerely consider a moral judgment like A ought to Saf, we're logically forced to ask whether we can prescribe that everyone in similar circumstances should act the same way. And because the pronoun I, it's what philosophers call a pure indexical, meaning it just refers to the speaker. When we're moralizing, we have to put ourselves in everyone else's shoes, and we have to give equal weight to everyone's preferences. And this leads to what he calls universalized prudence, which is basically this really far-sighted consideration of everyone's interests as if they were our own.
So for a philosopher, this is where things get really interesting and also really controversial. Zeno Wendler, for example, he made this sharp distinction between the semantic claim that I is a pure indexical, which is pretty uncontroversial, and the more metaphysical claim that I can refer to, like a pure subject that can imaginatively take on any role or state, even contradictory ones.
Yeah, and Hare, he seemed totally willing to embrace this idea that, like, I might be Napoleon. Like, he thought we could imagine ourselves as literally being other people, and the only difference would be the contingent details, not the fundamental structure of the situation. He even considered the possibility of identifying with inanimate objects, like a stove or a mountain, although he did admit that this might be a bit pointless, since we can't really imagine caring about what happens to us if we no longer exist as conscious beings.
Uh-huh. Okay, that's pretty out there. I mean, it seems more intuitive to think of like being like Napoleon or being in his situation rather than actually being him with all his thoughts and memories.
Right, and that's exactly what Wendler and others argued. But Hare's key move here was to say that even when we're just hypothesizing, like if I were Napoleon, we're already identifying with his prescriptions, with his desires.
Right, but if I is really fully prescriptive, as Hare says it is, then wouldn't that mean that, like, if I imagine myself as Napoleon, I could also prescribe his defeat, even though he obviously wouldn't want that?
Yeah, that's a great point. And that's where Hare introduces this weaker form of identification. He says that when we're doing moral reasoning, we have to give some weight to our preferences as they would be in that imagined situation, but no more weight than we give to our preferences in any other situation. And this, of course, leads to the requirement of weighing all relevant preferences equally.
Okay, so this brings up a really important question. Which preferences are we supposed to take into account? I mean, if the I in moral reasoning is really fully prescriptive, does that mean that when I imagine myself in someone else's shoes, I have to adopt all of their preferences, even the ones that don't directly affect them, but are about other people or the world in general?
Yeah, that's a tough one. And Hare, he sometimes talked about impartiality specifically between interests, which is a narrower category than just preferences in general. Our analysis kind of explores the possibility of distinguishing between a sympathetic interpretation, I, where we're focused on preferences about our own experiences, and a more egocentric interpretation, where we're focused on desires that, like, point back to the person who has them.
Right, so it's like, are we supposed to be concerned with what other people want for themselves or with what they want for the world? That's a big difference.
Totally. And for Hare, who's trying to build this really precise and logically rigorous ethical system, these different interpretations, they create a lot of problems.
Yeah, I can see that. And I mean, theoretically, you could try to bridge the gap between Hare's preference-based utilitarianism and more traditional pleasure-based or happiness-based utilitarianism by putting some restrictions on the kinds of preferences we consider. Like maybe we should only focus on now-for-now preferences, desires about immediate experiences, or then-for-then preferences, desires about future experiences at that future time. And maybe we should only consider preferences that are like internal, relating to the person's own conscious states rather than external preferences that are about other people or the world.
Right. But Hare, following Richard Brandt, he argued that, like an ideally rational agent, they would want to maximize their present preferences after they've been fully informed by logic and all the relevant facts. And this raises all sorts of issues about paternalism, the idea that we know what's best for someone even if they don't agree, and about the whole problem of figuring out what someone would want if they were fully informed.
Yeah, it's like, how do you even determine that? It seems impossible. And the problem is that Hare's framework, it makes it really hard to justify putting any restrictions on the range of preferences we consider. Because if you're committed to universalizability, you have to be willing to, like, identify with all affected agents.
Yeah.
And Hare, he consistently argued that we should give some weight to all preferences.
Right, and that creates all sorts of practical and theoretical headaches. Like, how do you compare now for then preferences? How much weight do you give to desires about the future versus desires about the present? And what about external preferences? How do you assess their intensity? And what about preferences that are based on ignorance? Or even preferences about remaining ignorant.
Yeah, and the very idea of preference itself, it gets really messy. I mean, what's the difference between a felt desire and a dispositional desire? And how do you measure the strength of a preference? I mean, for a theory that's supposed to be grounded in the logic of moral language, all this ambiguity about preferences, it's a real problem.
Totally. And then there's this whole other area where Hare applied his ideas, the ethics of bringing new people into existence. His argument was basically that if we're glad that we exist, then we should, all things being equal, prescribe the existence of other beings who are like us in their capacity for having a good life.
Interesting. And what's really cool is that this argument kind of invokes the idea of past imperatives. Like, our present gladness, it retroactively justifies the conditions that led to our existence.
Right, but the question is Hare really isolating the right attitude here? Is it really about being glad for our own existence, or is it more about a general appreciation for the existence of conscious life? And how does that distinction affect the whole process of universalization? It's a subtle point, but it could be really important.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so let's talk about one of the most practical aspects of Hare's theory, the distinction between two levels of moral thinking. So he talks about the critical level, which is like the ideal level, where you're using the full force of the golden rule and universalizability. And then you've got the intuitive level, which is more like everyday morality, where we rely on simpler rules and principles.
And he uses these kind of provocative terms, archangels for the critical thinkers and proles for the intuitive thinkers, although he's clear that these are just roles, not like social classes.
Right. And this distinction, it's really important for Hare because it lets him separate the question of how we should act from the question of how we should think about acting. Like, he recognizes that we have to take into account the real world consequences of both our actions and our ways of thinking.
Exactly. And he introduces these two really important concepts. Observance utility, or OU, which is basically the overall good that would result from everyone consistently following a particular moral principle, and acceptance utility, or AU, which is the good that would result from people generally intending to act in accordance with that principle. And he points out that really specific, complex principles, they might have high OU, but low AU, because people just aren't very good at following complicated rules all the time.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like, a rule against adultery, it might have high observance utility in theory, but in practice, it's really hard for people to follow consistently.
Exactly. And this two-level framework, it helps Hare respond to some of the classic objections to utilitarianism. Like, what about cases where utilitarianism seems to clash with our moral intuitions? Like a classic example of the sheriff who has to decide whether to frame an innocent person to prevent a riot.
Oh, yeah, that's a tough one.
Right. So our intuition is to say that it's always wrong to frame an innocent person, no matter what the consequences. But a pure act utilitarian might say that, well, in this case, framing the innocent person would actually maximize happiness because it would prevent a lot of suffering.
Right, so how does Hare deal with that?
Well, he says that our intuition against framing innocent people, that's actually a really important constraint on our intuitive level reasoning. It's like a rule of thumb that's been recommended by critical level thinking. So even though a pure act utilitarian might say it's okay to frame the innocent person in this specific case, Hare would say that, no, our intuitive principles are there for a reason and we shouldn't just ignore them.
Okay, but then the problem is, can we really believe in those intuitive principles if we know that they're not, like, fully justified at the critical level? Like, if we know that they're just rules of thumb, not absolute moral truths, then won't they be easier to break when it's convenient?
Yeah, that's a great point. And philosophers like Bernard Williams and J.L. Mackie, they both raised this objection. They argued that there's this tension between the intuitive level and the critical level, like they're pulling us in different directions.
So how did Hare respond to that?
He uses this analogy of a battle commander who has to balance like tactical considerations with the overall strategic goals of the war and with the established principles of military conduct. And he later develops this idea further by talking about prima facie principles, which are basically moral rules that create a feeling of compunction when we violate them, even if we have good consequentialist reasons for doing so.
Right, so it's not quite remorse, because we might still think we did the right thing overall, but there's still this feeling of unease.
Exactly. And this leads to the question of, like, what does it even mean to be bad or to do something wrong at the intuitive level if we can sometimes justify those actions at the critical level? Hare's response is that our intuitive moral concepts, they can actually change over time in response to critical reflection. But the tension that Williams and Mackie identified, it's still there.
Yeah, it's a tough one. Okay, so finally, let's talk a bit about Hare's views on religion and metaethics, where you can see the influence of logical positivism.
Yeah.
He thought that religious belief in the modern world, it had moved beyond just like simple factual claims. And he introduced this concept of a blick, which is basically a non-cognitive attitude, a way of seeing the world that gives people moral confidence.
Right. And his son, John Hare, who's also a philosopher, he's said that his father's skepticism about religion was connected to the ideas of logical positivism, like the verification principle, which says that we can only make meaningful statements about things that can be empirically verified. And Richard Hare himself, He famously argued that, practically speaking, there's no difference between a transcendental story that's actually true and a myth that serves the same function.
Interesting. And in Metaethics, this positivist influence led Hare to be really skeptical of philosophical disagreements. He thought that a lot of them were just verbal disputes, like people using different words to describe the same underlying experiences. And he was especially skeptical of terms like true, fact, and objective, because he thought they were too vague and ambiguous.
Yeah, and there's this really striking passage in his unpublished paper on moral objectivity where he's reflecting on his experiences as an interpreter in a Japanese POW camp. He talks about how when he was trying to persuade the Japanese commander to improve conditions for the prisoners, he had to appeal to the observable facts of the situation, the suffering, the injustice, rather than to some abstract moral.